Hey guys, tonight we begin with one of the quietest yet most haunting struggles of the First World War. Not the roar of artillery, nor the rush of charging lines, but something softer, something inside the body itself. The persistence of hunger. It was a hunger that never left, shaping every moment, every memory, every letter home. Promises of meals often melted into reality that was thin, tasteless, or simply missing. And in the midst of mud and fear, men were left to fight a quieter battle, one not with bullets, but with their own empty stomachs. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I create here. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight, and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see the world come together in these quiet hours. Now, dim the lights. Maybe let a soft hum fill the room, and let's drift gently into this forgotten story of the trenches, where surviving hunger on the battlefield was almost impossible. When we imagine the First World War, our thoughts often turn quickly to the deafening roar of artillery, to the flashes of shells lighting the horizon, or to the desperate charges across no man's land. Yet, in truth, much of a soldier's time at the front was marked by silence, by waiting, and by the long stretches of stillness that seemed to drag on without end. It is within this slower rhythm that hunger made itself most deeply felt. Before shells could be heard, and before rifles cracked, the stomach often made its quiet complaint. Picture, if you will, the long trench lines stretching across muddy fields in France or Belgium. These trenches were not uniform or neat, but crooked, irregular passages dug hastily into the earth, their walls reinforced by rotting timber and sandbags that sagged under the weight of rain. Within them, the men stood ankle-deep in mud, their boots never dry, their uniforms damp with both mist and sweat. Above their heads, the world seemed empty, grey skies stretching on without a hint of sunlight. The seasons mattered little, for in every season the trenches remained unpleasant. In summer, they stank of rot and disease. In winter, they froze into silent, frost-covered ditches. Yet, in every season, hunger followed the men. It is tempting to imagine hunger as a dramatic thing, a sudden pang that sharpens into unbearable pain. In reality, it is often duller, slower, more like an unwelcome companion that refuses to leave. Soldiers at the front knew this feeling well. Their hunger was not the sharp emptiness of a missed meal, but the constant low ache of never quite having enough. They were given rations, of course, but rations rarely arrived in the form promised on paper. Official lists might describe meat, bread, and vegetables, but what reached the men was more often tins of bully beef, biscuits so hard they could crack teeth, and tea brewed in water that tasted faintly of rust and smoke. Even in the best of times, the food filled the stomach, but left the spirit longing. There is something almost strange about how ordinary the hunger felt to those men. It was not spoken of in dramatic terms. In letters, soldiers would write of food almost casually, as though noting the weather. One man might remark that the biscuits were as hard as bricks, while another might say that bully beef was better than nothing. Their words carried no outrage, only a resigned acceptance. Hunger became so ordinary that it slipped into the background of every day. It was less an event and more a condition of existence. Still, the hunger made itself known in curious ways. Soldiers often carried with them small, secret tokens of food. A crumb of chocolate from home, carefully wrapped and hidden in a pocket. A half-eaten biscuit tucked away in a tin, saved for a moment when the stomach's ache became too distracting. These were not meals, not even snacks in any real sense, but talismans. To hold a piece of chocolate, even uneaten, was to remember the world beyond the trenches. It was to imagine a kitchen, a table, a sense of fullness. In this way, hunger was bound to memory as much as to the body. The trenches themselves seemed built to deepen the sense of want. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth, mixed with smoke from fires and the faint tang of cordite. Every smell reminded the men of what they did not have. The smoke might bring to mind roasted meat, though no such meal would appear. The damp might recall the smell of vegetables pulled from the soil, though no vegetables would come. Even the smell of tobacco, shared between soldiers, could stir a memory of meals once eaten in warm kitchens far away. Hunger sharpened the senses, turning every odour into a reminder of food absent. And then there was the strange sound of food in the trenches. Not the sound of cooking, for real cooking was rare, but the sound of men chewing hard biscuits. It is a detail rarely noted, yet those who were there remembered it. A row of men breaking teeth against rock-hard rations created a sound unlike anything else, a dull cracking that echoed strangely in the silence between bombardments. Some joked that the biscuits were stronger than the sandbags, and a few men even tried to carve them into small shapes, as though turning food into art might make it more palatable. This odd practice, quietly shaping rock-like bread into chess pieces or crude figurines, was one of hunger's strange gifts. When food cannot satisfy, imagination must. In the evenings, when the guns quieted and the men huddled into dugouts, conversation often turned to food, not to the tins and biscuits they had before them, but to meals remembered. One soldier might describe in slow detail the Sunday roast his family made each week, with potatoes crisped at the edges and gravy poured generously over everything. Another might speak of pies cooling on windowsills, their crusts golden and fragrant. These were not quick conversations, but long, lingering recitations. The men described every texture, every smell, every bite, as though by speaking it aloud they could taste it again. Hunger, in this way, created a kind of ritual. These imaginary banquets became a comfort greater than the food they actually held in their hands. Curiously, some soldiers began to believe that dreaming of food was more than just a product of an empty stomach. A quiet superstition grew among them, one rarely written in official accounts, but whispered from man to man. It was said that if a soldier dreamed of bread, plain and simple bread, he would survive another day. Perhaps it was only coincidence, or perhaps it was the mind's way of giving hope. Still, the belief persisted, and in the cold silence of the night, men spoke softly of the dreams that had come to them. Hunger, then, became not only a physical condition but a strange, almost spiritual guide. As the night deepened, the battlefield itself seemed to hunger. The earth trembled with distant shells, though the men were too weary to flinch. Their stomachs growled in rhythm with the distant rumble. The battlefield consumed everything: food, strength, and even the sense of time. Days blurred together, marked only by the arrival or absence of meals. Morning might bring a tin of bully beef if the supply lines held, or nothing at all if they failed. Evening might mean bread so stale it shattered like stone, or it might mean hunger carried into another night. The rhythm of hunger was as steady as the guns, and so hunger became a quiet, constant, less visible than mud or wire, yet no less deadly. To survive in the trenches was to endure this unending ache. It was not glorious nor dramatic, but deeply ordinary. The men did not write of it as one might describe a battle, yet in their silence, hunger's presence is clear. In the softest details, the way a man lingered over a crumb of chocolate, or the way he carved shapes from biscuits, we find the true picture of hunger on the battlefield. It was not only about the absence of food, but about the way imagination, memory, and even superstition filled the empty spaces left behind. In this way, hunger set the scene more than any weapon. It coloured every hour, guided every thought, and became the unseen enemy that stood beside the soldiers at every moment. When we think of the battlefield, we might picture barbed wire or artillery, but perhaps it is more fitting to picture a soldier staring quietly at his tin of rations, hearing his stomach complain, and wondering if tomorrow would bring more of the same. Hunger was not a single moment, but the slow, unending backdrop of life in the trenches. This was the world they lived in, a world where silence was heavy, where the air smelled of damp earth and smoke, and where the sound of breaking biscuits filled the long pauses between bombardments. It was a world defined not only by mud and war, but by the quiet, gnawing ache of a stomach that never felt full. Hunger, in all its dull persistence, was the true setting of the battlefield, and it is here that our story begins. When one thinks of the life of a soldier during the First World War, the mind might instinctively move toward the trenches, the mud, or the ever-present sounds of artillery. But if you look just a little closer, beyond the smoke and the noise, you find another reality that shaped the day-to-day existence of those men. This reality was measured not in bullets, but in morsels of food. Soldiers were told what they could expect to eat. They were given numbers, weights, and descriptions of what the army promised to deliver. These promises became part of official documents, part of the regulations. But as with many things in war, the words on the page and the actual food on the plate were not the same. The official rations of the British Army, for example, might sound almost generous on paper. The soldier was meant to receive a daily issue of bread, or later, hard biscuits, if bread could not be baked. Alongside that, there was to be a portion of meat, perhaps some bacon in the morning, with occasional helpings of fresh vegetables or even jam. The numbers were carefully written out. A pound of bread, 3/4 of a pound of meat, and perhaps a bit of cheese. A similar pattern existed across other armies. The French soldier was promised his daily ration of bread, wine, and meat, while the German soldier was expected to be sustained by his dark rye bread, sausages, and potatoes. On paper, it looked structured, almost scientific. An army, after all, is a great machine, and food was one of its fuels. But the reality that reached the muddy ground of the Western Front was often far from those tidy lists. The journey from a field kitchen to a frontline trench could be many miles, and along the way, supplies met with endless obstacles, bombed roads, broken railways, and the unpredictable rhythms of battle itself. A loaf of bread sent out in the morning might arrive by evening, soggy from the rain and flecked with mud. A ration of meat, if it ever reached the men, might be stringy, tough, or worse, rancid. Sometimes what was supposed to be served as fresh food was replaced with tins, those metal containers that promise something edible within, though not always palatable. Soldiers quickly grew familiar with the strange taste of preserved beef, the infamous bully beef, that appeared with numbing regularity. It is in this distance between what was promised and what was given that the experience of hunger lived. Soldiers were reminded, through the lists, of what they should have been eating. Yet, day by day, they were confronted with the truth of what actually filled their stomachs. Imagine the feeling of looking forward to something a proper meal, perhaps bread with butter, maybe meat cooked properly, only to find that what arrives is thin soup and half a biscuit. Over time, this quiet disappointment seeps deeper than hunger itself. It becomes a kind of daily erosion of spirit, the slow recognition that the promise and the reality were separated by miles of mud, supply shortages, and human error. The uniqueness of this situation lies not simply in the lack of food, but in the strange substitutions that armies made in the effort to keep their men alive. In some cases, flour was stretched with ground-up turnips or dried peas. Bread was baked with less and less wheat, until it resembled more of a dense, chewy cake than anything comforting. Soldiers sometimes joked, though not with much laughter, that their bread was heavy enough to serve as a weapon if thrown. Meat, too, became curious in form. If no beef could be found, sometimes horses were slaughtered, and the men were left to chew on what once might have been a transport animal. In desperation, certain armies even experimented with ersatz foods, artificial substitutes. German soldiers, for example, drank coffee that was not coffee at all but roasted acorns, barley, or even ground up chicory roots. There is a strange curiosity in imagining how these foods tasted, not because they were delicacies, but because they were so far removed from what one might expect. Soldiers recorded in their diaries that their jam sometimes carried a metallic taste, likely from the tins, and that their biscuits were so hard they needed to be soaked in tea before they could be bitten. One soldier remarked that the biscuits could break teeth, though he wrote it with the calm detachment of someone who knew it was simply part of life. Another curious fact comes from the texture of bully beef. When opened, it sometimes emerged in a solid block, a pale mass that quivered slightly but held together. The soldiers learned to slice it like a loaf, though its taste was more salt and fat than anything resembling beef. It was food, yes, but only just. The promise of rations also carried an element of morale. To be told that your army would provide certain amounts of bread and meat was in its own way a reassurance. It suggested order, planning, and care from the authorities above. When those rations fell short, it was not only the stomach that felt emptier, but also the heart. Soldiers began to question the value of those promises. Did those in the rear truly know what the men at the front were living on? Did the officers ever taste the same tins, or bite into the same hardened biscuits? The very act of eating became a reminder of one's place in the vast hierarchy of war, a small cog in a machine that sometimes forgot the humanity of those it kept in motion. The unique strangeness of all this is that hunger did not always come from outright absence. More often, it came from the monotony of what was present. Eating the same food day after day reduces it to little more than a task. Imagine, if you will, sitting down to every meal and knowing that what awaited you was another tin of the same beef, another slab of the same bread, another spoon of the same thin stew. Hunger sometimes sharpened not because of quantity, but because of sameness. The body craved variety, a fresh apple, a taste of butter, something unexpected. Deprived of it, the men found themselves not only hungry in the belly, but starved in the imagination. Here lies the quiet, almost meditative truth of the rations promised versus reality. It is not a story of constant starvation in the dramatic sense, but rather a story of daily compromise, of hopes adjusted, of expectations lowered. Promises on paper remained neat, official, and reassuring. Reality in the trenches remained stubborn, muddy, and often disappointing. Between the two was the soldier, sitting on the damp earth with his mess tin, looking into it with weary eyes, and wondering, once again, what had happened to the meal he had been told to expect. In reflecting on this, one might notice how, even now, a braid. Century later, those lists of promised rations survive in archives, looking tidy and official. They remain unspoiled by mud, untouched by rain. Yet the truth of the soldier's experience was preserved not in official documents, but in the faded ink of letters home, in diary entries scribbled by candlelight, in the memories that lingered long after. They tell us not only about food, but about the fragile balance between what is expected and what is endured. And it is within this quiet balance that the story of hunger on the battlefield begins to unfold, one ration at a time. If one were to step quietly into the life of a soldier on the Western Front, not through the noise of artillery but through the quieter, slower rituals of daily living, one would almost certainly find themselves staring into a mess tin. That small, battered container, often dented and blackened by fire, became the window into a world of food that was as strange as it was monotonous. The diet of a soldier, though meant to sustain, was a curious collection of oddities that blended the familiar with the unfamiliar, the nourishing with the questionable, and the edible with the barely tolerable. To explore this strange diet is to wander into a corner of history where hunger was managed not with richness but with improvisation, and where meals were consumed not with joy but with the steady patience of survival. One of the most infamous items on the soldiers' menu was bully beef, that tinned corned beef which made its way into countless rations. On the surface, it seemed practical meat that could survive transport, sealed tightly against the elements, resistant to spoilage. But when the tins were opened, what greeted the soldiers was not a meal in any comforting sense, but a block of greasy, pinkish meat, solid enough to be sliced yet soft enough to wobble faintly. Its flavour was overwhelmingly salty, its texture stringy, and its fat congealed in strange patterns that clung to the inside of the tin. Some soldiers described it as bearable only when mixed with hard biscuit crumbs or when cooked into a stew, though cooking was not always possible. Others wrote of its peculiar smell, something metallic and sour, lingering even after the food was gone. For many, bully beef was less of a dish and more of a recurring presence, an unavoidable guest at every meal. Alongside the bully beef came the notorious hardtack biscuits. These were not the biscuits one might imagine with butter and tea, but rather slabs of baked flour so dense and so unyielding that they seemed designed more as construction material than as food. Soldiers often joked that they could break a tooth, though the joke was repeated so often it began to feel less like humour and more like weary truth. The biscuits were so hard that men resorted to soaking them in water, tea, or even stew until they softened into a thick, mushy paste. Others smashed them with rifle butts or stones before eating, reducing them to crumbs that could be swallowed more easily. There was, in the simple act of eating a biscuit, a small ritual of labour, a preparation that made every meal slightly slower, slightly more effortful, and always tinged with the frustration of chewing something that had long ceased to resemble bread. Strangeness crept into the soldier's diet in subtler ways too. The scarcity of fresh food meant that many armies relied heavily on substitutes. Coffee, when it appeared, was often not coffee at all but roasted acorns, chicory roots, or barley. Soldiers would boil it into a thin, bitter brew that carried the faint illusion of warmth and familiarity, though it lacked the rich aroma or taste of true coffee. In Germany, ersatz foods became common, a kind of shadow cuisine born out of necessity. Bread was mixed with potato flour or even sawdust to stretch it further. Sausages contain not only meat but also fillers such as turnips or beets, their flavour drifting far from the hearty sausages of Prue's peacetime. These substitutions carried with them a quiet strangeness. They looked familiar but tasted alien, leaving the soldiers caught between recognition and disappointment. Curiously, jam became one of the few small comforts in the diet, though even it was not immune to strangeness. British soldiers were often issued tins of plum and apple jam, so frequently that the flavour became almost symbolic of the war. Men joked that they would never again touch plum jam after the trenches, so completely had it taken over their lives. The jam was sticky, sweet, and cloying, a brief distraction from the salt of bully beef and the hardness of biscuits. Yet it was also monotonous, arriving so often that its sweetness dulled into another form of fatigue. Some soldiers tried spreading it on biscuits, others stirred it into tea, while a few even mixed it with meat to create an odd, sweet salty concoction that only the desperate would attempt. There were also curious moments of invention. as soldiers tried to reshape their limited ingredients into something resembling variety. With bully beef, biscuits and jam as their foundation, they concocted improvised recipes. One dish, sometimes called trench stew, was made by mixing bully beef with crushed biscuits, water, and whatever scraps of vegetables could be scavenged. Another improvised dish involved heating bully beef with jam, a combination that produced a sticky, salty sweet mixture that defied culinary logic yet filled the stomach. In the absence of flour, some men used crushed biscuits to make a crude kind of porridge, boiling it into a paste that could be spooned rather than chewed. These small acts of culinary creativity were less about pleasure and more about survival, though they did create strange and unique flavors that were remembered long after the war ended. Another peculiarity of the soldiers' diet was the relationship between food and weather. In the cold, damp trenches of winter, the fat from bully beef hardened into a waxy substance that clung to everything it touched. Soldiers described how it coated their fingers, their mess tins, and even the surface of their tea if not carefully cleaned away. In the heat of summer, the same fat melted into an oily liquid that seeped unpleasantly from the tins, soaking into biscuits or dripping onto clothes. The food seemed always to resist comfort, changing its form with the seasons, never entirely stable, never entirely welcome. Eating was less about satisfaction and more about enduring what the war placed in front of you. There were, however, rare and curious moments of luxury. Occasionally, soldiers might come across parcels from home containing chocolate, tinned fruit, or a small piece of cake. These foods, ordinary in peacetime, became treasures in the trenches. A single square of chocolate could be savoured slowly, melting on the tongue, its sweetness almost overwhelming after months of monotony. A tin of peaches, if shared among a group, became a feast, each soldier taking a spoonful of syrup as though it were a rare wine. The contrast between these luxuries and the daily diet made them all the more striking. They revealed how deeply the palate had adjusted to strangeness, so that the ordinary became extraordinary and the extraordinary became unforgettable. One of the more peculiar aspects of the soldier's diet is how it imprinted itself on memory. Decades after the war, veterans could still recall the taste of bully beef, the hardness of biscuits, the endless presence of plum jam. These foods became inseparable from the memory of the trenches, as though they carried within them not just calories, but the entire weight of experience. Food that in peacetime would be dismissed as poor or unpleasant became, in memory, a symbol of endurance. The strange diet of the soldier thus lived on, not in cookbooks, but in recollections, in the quiet admission that this was what had sustained men through a conflict that reshaped the world. If we linger here, in this examination of the soldier's table, we begin to see how strangeness became routine. Bully beef, hardtack, ersatz coffee, and jam, none of these would be celebrated in culinary history. Yet, in their persistence, they became the foundations of survival. The soldier's diet was strange not only because of its content, but because of how it blurred the line between nourishment and endurance, between eating and coping. To chew on a biscuit until it softened was not only to eat but to accept. To open another tin of bully beef was not only to dine but to confront the sameness of life in the trenches. And to spread another spoon of jam was not only to taste sweetness but also to recognize the faint absurdity of finding comfort in monotony. In the end, the strange diet of the soldier was not about satisfaction, but about persistence. It was a collection of foods that were heavy, bland, repetitive, and often unpleasant, yet they were consumed with the steady patience of men who had little choice. They were strange, yes, but in their strangeness lay a kind of quiet dignity. For through these meals, through the salty beef, the stone-hard biscuits, the ersatz coffee, and the ever-present jam, men endured one spoonful at a time. And it is in that endurance, in that quiet persistence, that we find the heart of this chapter, a reminder that even in the most unremarkable meals, history leaves its imprint. There comes a moment in every soldier's recollection of the First World War when the issue of food shifts from being a matter of dissatisfaction to one of genuine absence. For much of the war, men lived in a rhythm of rations, however repetitive or unappetizing. There was always a tin to be opened, a biscuit to be cracked against the butt of a rifle, or a small smear of jam to spread thinly. But there were days when even these bare constants slipped away. To understand what it was like when food ran out is to enter into a slow, heavy atmosphere of waiting, of staring into an empty mess tin, and of realizing that hunger was no longer something to be managed with monotony, but something to be endured in its rawest form. Running out of food was rarely sudden. It was more often a gradual dwindling, like watching a candle burn down until only the faintest stub remained. The parcels from home arrived less frequently, the tins carried up from the supply lines became fewer, and the portions ladled into mess tins grew smaller. A soldier might have once expected half a loaf of bread to be shared between 2 men, but now it was shared among 4. A tin of bully beef that once seemed tiresome became suddenly precious, divided carefully so that every man received at least a spoonful. The hunger crept in slowly, not with drama, but with the quiet persistence of a damp chill that refuses to lift. The strangeness lay not only in the absence of food, but in the way the men adjusted their expectations without protest, as though shrinking portions were simply another part of the trench landscape, like the mud or the lice. What is curious about these times of scarcity is how quickly the mind begins to fill the gaps left by the stomach. Men began to talk about food more often, almost obsessively. They described meals they had once eaten, or those they hoped to have again someday. The absence of food gave rise to a feast in the imagination. One man might recall his mother's roast, crisp potatoes, and thick gravy, while another described the sweetness of fresh fruit picked from a tree in summer. These conversations carried a strange comfort, even though they deepened the awareness of present hunger. To speak of food was to keep it alive in memory, to remind one another that the world outside the trench still contained flavors, smells, and textures far removed from the bland emptiness of war. When food ran out, the soldiers often turned to foraging. This was not foraging in the romantic sense of wandering fields in search of wild berries, but rather scavenging in the ruined landscapes around them. Abandoned farms sometimes yielded potatoes left in the ground, or onions overlooked in a storage shed. Soldiers would dig through the remains of gardens or scrape together whatever green shoots could be found. In towns reduced to rubble, they might search cellars for preserved jars, long forgotten by their owners. Yet this foraging came with strangeness. Vegetables dug hastily from the earth were sometimes eaten raw, dirt still clinging to them. Preserves discovered in shattered homes might be years old, their taste sharp or sour, but still swallowed gratefully. Hunger, after all, has a way of redefining what counts as edible. One of the stranger practices, quietly recorded in diaries, was the boiling of almost anything that might yield flavour. Soldiers boiled nettles to create a bitter, green soup. They boiled grass, weeds, and sometimes even candle ends, hoping to extract some hint of fat or substance. Bread crusts, if found, were reboiled into a watery porridge. In the absence of meat, bones salvaged from old meals were boiled again and again until they gave up the last traces of their essence. What resulted was less a meal and more a faintly flavoured water, yet even that was consumed carefully, savoured slowly as though it were more substantial than it truly was. The uniqueness of these practices lies not in their success, but in their persistence, a testament to the quiet determination of men who refused to let hunger defeat them, even if their stomachs remained hollow. Another curious detail of hunger was the way it altered the senses. Men described how smells grew sharper, how even the faintest aroma of food carried across the trenches and stirred longing. A whiff of coffee from an officer's quarters, or the faint scent of frying bacon from a distant camp, could trigger an almost painful awareness of what was missing. The imagination of taste became sharper too. Bread was no longer just bread in the mind's eye. It was crusty, golden and steaming, its smell vivid, its texture soft and warm. Hunger, in its peculiar way, enriched memory even as it starved the body. The absence of food made the thought of food more real, more alive than food itself had ever been. There were also moments of barter and exchange as men traded whatever they had left to fill the gnawing emptiness. A small tin of jam became a treasure to be bartered for tobacco, or a single biscuit could be swapped for a favour. In some accounts, men even traded buttons or bits of kit for a morsel of something edible. Hunger reshaped value, making the ordinary precious and the trivial negotiable. What is strange here is not the trading itself, but the quiet civility with which it was often conducted. Even in hunger, there remained an unspoken understanding that survival was not only personal but collective, and that to share or exchange was a way of maintaining humanity amidst deprivation. At times, when rations failed completely, hunger became a silent companion to other hardships. Soldiers grew weaker, their movements slower, their thoughts more sluggish. Letters from home describe how men sometimes admitted to fainting or sleeping from sheer exhaustion, not only from battle but from lack of sustenance. Yet this was rarely recorded in official reports. Armies were reluctant to admit that their soldiers were not properly fed, so the stories of real hunger slipped quietly into personal accounts rather than public records. This silence is its own kind of strangeness, the absence of food mirrored by the absence of acknowledgement, as though to speak of hunger too openly would undermine the machinery of war itself. And yet, amidst these accounts, there are glimpses of peculiar resilience. A soldier might write of finding half a loaf of stale bread in the pocket of his coat and feeling as though he had discovered treasure. Another might describe the joy of boiling a potato, not because it was delicious, but because it was warm and solid in the stomach. These small victories over hunger, these fleeting moments of relief, stand out against the backdrop of emptiness. They reveal how the human spirit clings to nourishment in whatever form it appears, and how even the plainest morsel can feel extraordinary when contrasted with nothing at all. Perhaps the most unusual aspect of food scarcity on the battlefield was the way it shaped dreams. Soldiers often recorded dreams of food, elaborate banquets filled with dishes they had not seen in years. These dreams were vivid, sometimes painfully so, with the smells and tastes lingering upon waking. To dream of food while lying hungry in a dugout, surrounded by mud and rats, is a strange contradiction. Yet it also reflects the depth of the body's longing, the way hunger penetrates not only waking hours but also the quiet of sleep. In this sense, when food ran out, it did not vanish entirely. It returned in memory, in talk, and in dreams, haunting the mind as persistently as the stomach. To reflect on these times of hunger is to move beyond the statistics of rations and into the quieter, more personal spaces of survival. When food ran out, soldiers found themselves navigating a world where every crumb mattered, where imagination became a substitute for sustenance, and where even the simplest flavors were elevated into luxuries. It is a story not of dramatic starvation, but of slow, quiet deprivation, the kind that wears down the body gently, like water dripping steadily on stone. And within this slowness lies the unique strangeness of hunger in war, that in the absence of food, men found themselves nourished instead by memory, by imagination, and by the faint hope that tomorrow, perhaps, something edible might arrive. In the end, when food ran out, soldiers were not entirely defeated. They endured, as they endured the mud, the cold, and the endless noise of conflict. They adjusted, they improvised, and they survived, even when survival meant little more than drinking nettle soup or savouring the crust of a stale loaf. The story of hunger here is not one of sudden collapse, but of quiet endurance, stretched out over days and weeks, until the supply lines resumed and the tins arrived once more. And so the rhythm of hunger continued, a pattern of scarcity and relief, woven into the fabric of the war as surely as the trenches themselves. To dwell upon it now is to glimpse the quiet persistence of the human spirit, and to understand that when food ran out, life did not end, but slowed into a strange, heavy patience, waiting for the next small meal to arrive. To speak of food in wartime is often to speak not of what was eaten, but of what was replaced. The shortages of the First World War did not only leave soldiers without their promised rations, they created a world in which substitutes became common, a quiet shadow version of food. These were not imitations designed to deceive, but rather improvisations made out of necessity, to stretch what was available or to fill a gap left by scarcity. And so, soldiers found themselves consuming things that resembled familiar foods but carried strange flavours, unexpected textures, and an unmistakable reminder that the war had seeped into every part of life, even the taste of a morning drink or a slice of bread. To dwell upon these substitutes is to wander into a landscape of curiosities, where hunger was met not with abundance but with invention, and where the taste of survival was always slightly peculiar. One of the most widely remembered substitutes was coffee that was not coffee at all. Across Germany, where shortages grew severe under the strain of blockade, real coffee beans became rare luxuries, replaced by roasted acorns, barley, or chicory roots. The soldiers brewed these into a thin, dark liquid that resembled coffee in colour but not in taste. The bitterness was harsh, earthy, and often acrid, with none of the richness or aroma of real beans. Men described how it left a dryness in the mouth, a lingering aftertaste that seemed to echo the soil it came from. Yet, in the ritual of drinking, there remained a faint comfort. The warmth of the mug between one's hands, the steam rising in the cold morning air, gave the illusion of normalcy, even if the liquid within did not satisfy. It was not coffee, but it was something hot, and that small distinction mattered. Bread, too, became a canvas for substitution. Wheat was scarce, and so flour was stretched with anything that could be ground fine enough to mix with it. Potatoes, dried peas, even sawdust found their way into loaves. The bread that resulted was dense, heavy, and sometimes strangely bitter. Its texture was coarse, often gritty, and it crumbled in odd ways. Soldiers remarked that it filled the stomach but not the spirit. To bite into such bread was to taste not only the flour but also the compromise of war. It was bread, yes, but bread reshaped into something less than familiar, something that reminded the eater with every chew that scarcity governed even the most basic of foods. Perhaps the strangest substitutes came in the realm of meat. Fresh cuts were rare, and tins of bully beef could not always meet demand. In their place, armies sometimes turned to horse meat or even to sausages padded with fillers like turnips, beets or grains. The taste was inconsistent, sometimes bland, sometimes unpleasantly sweet, sometimes metallic. Horse meat, in particular, carried with it an unease, for these were animals that had shared the battlefield as companions and workers. To consume them felt at once practical and unsettling. as though necessity had blurred the line between ally and sustenance. Men chewed such meals slowly, aware not only of their hunger but of the strangeness of what they were consuming. It was a reminder that in war, nothing was safe from transformation, not even the animals that once pulled the guns. Jam, which might seem the least likely to suffer from substitution, was also reshaped. Real fruit was scarce, and so artificial jams were made from vegetable matter flavored with chemicals or sweetened with saccharin. Soldiers sometimes received tins of jam that looked bright and cheerful, but when spread on a biscuit revealed an odd, chemical sharpness, a flavor that lingered uneasily on the tongue. Some soldiers spoke of jam that tasted more of dye than fruit, leaving behind stains that seemed brighter than natural berries could ever produce. And yet it was eaten, spread thinly on bread or stirred into tea, because even a poor substitute was better than nothing at all. Hunger, after all, has a way of lowering the threshold of acceptability. There were substitutes, too, that bordered on the peculiar. In some places, butter was replaced with margarine made from animal fats or even fish oils, leaving behind a faintly unpleasant smell when spread. Sugar, scarce in many regions, was replaced with saccharin tablets, which dissolved into tea or coffee but left a strange aftertaste that was at once too sweet and too hollow. Milk was replaced with powdered substitutes, pale and thin, their flavour closer to chalk than cream. Even tobacco, though not food, was sometimes replaced with dried leaves of other plants, rolled into harsh cigarettes that burned quickly and tasted acrid. The very act of consumption became a reminder of absence, as though the real thing were always just out of reach. The uniqueness of these substitutes lies not only in their odd flavours, but in the way they were received. Soldiers did not always complain. More often, they adapted, accepting each new substitute as part of the shifting reality of war. They joked about acorn coffee, they grumbled about sawdust bread, but they drank and ate them nonetheless. Over time, what had once seemed strange became ordinary. The palate adjusted, if not happily, then at least resignedly. And in that resignation lay a kind of quiet endurance, a willingness to accept that the world, for the moment, would taste different, and that survival was measured not in pleasure, but in persistence. Strangeness also lay in the creativity that soldiers showed when faced with substitutes. Men learned to disguise unpleasant flavours by mixing them together. Sawdust bread might be dipped in ersatz coffee to soften its texture, or artificial jam might be spread over margarine to hide its fishy aftertaste. Meals became small experiments, carried out in mess tins over sputtering fires. Some of these combinations produced edible results, others less so. But the act of trying gave men a sense of control, however small, over what they ate. It was a reminder that even in scarcity, there remained room for invention, for the faint echo of cooking as it had been at home. One might think of these substitutes now as curiosities, odd relics of a desperate time, but for the soldiers who consumed them, they were not curiosities at all, they were daily reality. To drink coffee made of chicory, to chew bread flecked with potato flour, to eat jam that tasted faintly of chemicals, these were not rare experiences but constants, repeated again and again until they formed the fabric of daily life. And perhaps that is the strangest truth of all, that the taste of substitutes, no matter how odd, became the taste of the war itself. For when the familiar was gone, the unfamiliar stepped in, and over time, it ceased to feel strange at all. In reflecting on the taste of substitutes, we uncover not only the ingenuity of wartime, but also the quiet resilience of those who consumed them. These foods did not nourish in the way that real bread or coffee or meat might have done. They left the body hungry, the spirit longing. Yet they kept men alive, and in their persistence they became symbols of adaptation. The war may have taken away the familiar, but it did not take away the act of eating, nor the determination to endure, even if every bite carried the taste of compromise. And so, the soldiers ate, not what they wished for, not even what was promised, but what was possible. And in the slow chewing of sawdust bread, in the bitter swallow of acorn coffee, in the faint sweetness of artificial jam, history left its quiet, peculiar flavour. To imagine hunger on the battlefield is often to think of open spaces, of soldiers huddled in the mud of the trenches, dreaming of bread or meat that would never come. Yet hunger had another setting, quieter and more enclosed, in the dugouts that lay beneath the earth. These underground shelters were intended to provide protection from shell fire, but they also became places where men sat, waited, and wrestled with the gnawing emptiness in their stomachs. The dugout was not simply a refuge, it was a space of silence, of stale air, and of conversations that circled endlessly around food. Here, hunger felt different, enclosed, amplified by the closeness of the walls and the faint echo of men's voices in the darkness. It was in these dim, underground spaces that hunger became less of a passing discomfort and more of a lingering companion. The dugouts varied greatly. Some were rough shelters dug quickly into the earth, lined with timbers to prevent collapse. Others, particularly along sectors held for long periods, were more elaborate, with steps leading down into chambers that extended beneath the ground like hidden burrows. In either form, they were dimly lit, sometimes by flickering candles, sometimes by oil lamps that filled the air with their smell. The walls were damp, the floors muddy, and the air heavy with the odour of unwashed bodies, wet uniforms, and smoke. Food, when present, added its own distinct scent tins of bully beef, loaves of dense bread, sometimes a stew warmed over a small fire. But often there was little food at all, and in those moments the absence of scent became more noticeable than its presence. Hunger sharpened the senses, and men found themselves sniffing at empty tins or speaking with longing about meals that were not there. Hunger in the dugouts was not loud, not dramatic. It was quiet, creeping, and persistent. It did not arrive suddenly, but settled in slowly, a dull ache that grew over hours and days. The men knew it well, and they spoke of it in the calm tones of people who had little choice but to accept it. They compared the meals they had eaten at home, describing in detail the taste of bread just taken from an oven, or the way bacon sizzled in a pan. These conversations were not complaints so much as a way of passing time, of distracting themselves from the emptiness inside. Sometimes they shared recipes aloud, describing each step in careful detail, as though reciting them might conjure the food into existence. Hunger, in these moments, created a kind of strange intimacy, a shared longing that bound the men together. There was a peculiar ritual in the way soldiers handled food in the dugouts. When rations arrived, they were divided carefully, often with great seriousness, for no man wanted to be cheated of his share. A tin of meat might be opened and divided with a knife, each portion measured by sight and handed out in turn. Bread was cut into slices, sometimes with a bayonet if no knife was at hand, and shared out evenly. In these moments, hunger made fairness sacred. A man could forgive many things in the trenches, but being given less food than another could spark bitterness that lasted for days. The fairness of division became almost ceremonial, and the act of receiving one's portion carried with it not only relief but also a quiet recognition of trust among comrades. Yet hunger was not always satisfied, even when food was divided. Often the portions were too small, leaving men chewing slowly, stretching out their bites in an attempt to prolong the meal. Some would lick their knives clean, scraping every last trace of grease from the inside of a tin, or crumble bits of bread into their tea to soften it and make it last longer. These were not acts of desperation so much as small habits, ways of making the most of what little there was. Hunger taught men to be careful, to savour what they had, even if what they had was poor in quality or strange in taste. And in the dugouts, where the air was heavy and the hours passed slowly, such habits became almost meditative. The strangeness of dugout hunger lay also in the way it changed the perception of time. Hours stretched long in the darkness, and the gap between meals seemed to expand endlessly. A man might glance at his watch, convinced that hours had passed, only to find that only minutes had gone by. Hunger seemed to slow everything down, turning each moment into a reminder of the body's needs. Some men describe dreaming of food even while awake, their thoughts circling endlessly around the taste of things they could not have. In this way, hunger was not only physical but also mental, a quiet obsession that filled the air of the dugout as surely as the damp and the smoke. There were, too, moments of odd improvisation. When food ran low, men would sometimes scrape together the remnants of several meals, combining them into something new. Bits of biscuit softened in water, scraps of meat boiled into a thin broth, or tea brewed a second or even third time from the same leaves. These makeshift meals often tasted strange, but they carried with them the comfort of resourcefulness. It was not the taste that mattered so much as the act of eating, the sense that hunger could be pushed back for another hour, another day. Hunger made men inventive, and in the dugouts this inventiveness took on a peculiar quietness, born not of hope for better meals, but of the acceptance that these makeshifts were what the war allowed. In some dugouts, hunger carried with it a faint edge of the surreal. Men would carve small pieces of wood into the shapes of food, a loaf, a slice of cheese, even a sausage, as though to amuse themselves by creating what they could not eat. Others would sketch food in notebooks, doodling meals on the margins of letters. These gestures were playful, but they were also strangely poignant. They revealed the depth of longing that hunger inspired, and the way the mind sought to fill the absence with imagination. It was a quiet strangeness, one that might have seemed foolish to anyone well-fed. But in the dugouts it made sense. To draw a sausage was, in its own way, to taste it again in memory. There is something haunting about hunger in a place where men were surrounded by death and danger, and yet it was not the shells overhead that filled their thoughts in quiet moments, but the lack of food. Letters home were filled not only with accounts of the fighting, but with requests for parcels, cakes, tins of sardines, sweets, anything to break the monotony of army rations. These parcels, when they arrived, were treasured and often shared, though sometimes kept aside for private indulgence. In either case, they represented not only nourishment but a link to the world beyond the dugouts. A reminder that food once had variety, once had taste, once had warmth beyond its calories. To speak of hunger in the dugouts is to speak of patience, of endurance that was not dramatic but slow and quiet. It was not the hunger of famine, nor the sudden hunger of fasting, but a drawn-out emptiness that accompanied every day. It shaped conversations, habits, even dreams. It made men notice fairness in the dividing of bread, made them scrape tins clean with careful precision, made them laugh at wooden sausages and sketches of cakes. It was a hunger that bound them together, not by choice, but by necessity. And in the dim, damp air of the dugouts, that shared hunger became as much a part of life as the sound of shells above or the dripping of water through the walls. Perhaps the strangest thing of all is that many of these men, when they later remembered the war, spoke not only of the battles, nor of the losses, but of the taste of food or the lack of it in the dugouts. They remembered the way substitute bread crumbled in their hands, the sharpness of a Satz coffee, the rare sweetness of a parcel from home. Hunger, in this way, etched itself into memory as clearly as any other part of the war. To sit in a dugout, stomach empty, talking with a comrade about the taste of bacon at home, this was as much the war as the roar of artillery. Hunger, in its quiet persistence, became one of the defining companions of the soldiers beneath the ground. Letters from home often carried more than words. They carried the weight of memories, the reminder of a world that felt impossibly far away, and the faint promise of comfort that might never arrive in physical form. Soldiers in the dugouts and trenches waited for them, with a patience that was sometimes anxious, sometimes resigned. When a letter arrived, folded and marked by the journey through censors and postal delays, it was opened with the same care one might give to a rare gift. Inside, beyond the formal greetings and the news of daily life, there were often descriptions of meals, of food carefully prepared and casually described by family members who had no idea how those words might linger in the mind of a soldier. The memory of food became a kind of nourishment in itself, though one that did not fill the stomach. A wife might write of baking bread that morning, the crust still warm when it came out of the oven. A mother might mention a Sunday dinner with roasted chicken and potatoes served as they always had been, in a kitchen that seemed unchanged by the war. A sister might send a note about a simple apple pie, its sweetness and scent filling the house. These details were often written without intent, mere fragments of ordinary life, but for the men who read them, they became precious. The memory of those meals, painted in words, could fill a night in the dugout with imagined flavors, with remembered smells that almost seemed real in the darkness. The strangeness of this lies in how vividly the mind could recreate tastes long absent. A soldier who had not eaten fresh bread in months could, upon reading a description, summon the texture of its crust and the softness inside. He could almost smell it, as though the letter itself carried the aroma across the miles. Some men claimed they could taste their mother's cooking again when reading such lines, though it was only in memory. Hunger sharpened this imagination, turning simple phrases into vivid experiences. The mind did not need much to work with, just a mention of butter spread on toast, or of bacon sizzling in a pan, and suddenly the dugout seemed filled with invisible feasts. The body remained hungry, but the mind fed itself on memory. There was, too, a peculiar ritual that sometimes followed the reading of such letters. Men would gather and read aloud the passages about food, laughing softly or sighing together. They would discuss in detail the meals described, comparing them to their own memories of similar dishes. In these moments, the letter did not belong to one man alone, but became shared property, a communal reminder of what life outside the trenches still offered. Hunger, in this sense, became less lonely, transformed by the act of imagining together. One could almost say that the dugout became a dining hall of memory, with each man contributing his own recollections to the feast. There were stranger habits as well. Some soldiers kept small notebooks where they copied recipes mentioned in letters, as though they were collecting a cookbook to use after the war. These notebooks often included not only the meals described by family, but also recipes invented in conversation, imagined dishes that could never be made. One man might write down a recipe for a cake made of biscuits and tea, while another described a stew of bully beef, transformed into something more elaborate with vegetables that were not available. These imaginary recipes, born of hunger and memory, were cherished. To write them down gave a sense of control, a sense that food, though absent, was still within reach in some form. The hunger tied to letters from home also created moments of contradiction. Soldiers longed for these descriptions of meals, yet sometimes found them almost painful. To read of plenty while surrounded by scarcity could sharpen the ache of hunger, making the small rations of the trenches seem even more meagre. Yet most still preferred to receive these words, even if they brought longing, because they kept alive a connection to the world outside. It was better to feel the ache of memory than to feel forgotten, and better to imagine a feast than to accept the emptiness without distraction. The letters reminded them that food still existed somewhere, even if not here. One of the stranger curiosities lies in how soldiers sometimes altered the letters when sharing them. A man might exaggerate the description of a meal, adding details not present in the original words, to make it more vivid for himself and his comrades. A simple mention of bread might become a description of golden crust and soft butter. A passing note about dinner might expand into a full account of courses and flavors. These embellishments were not lies, but rather acts of imagination, a way of honoring the memory of food by making it fuller, more satisfying in its telling. In this sense, the letters became seeds for stories that grew larger than the words written on paper. There is also something curious in how soldiers wrote back. Many avoided speaking of hunger directly, not wishing to worry their families. Instead, they often responded with their own descriptions of food, sometimes inventing meals they had not eaten to create the impression that all was well. A man might write that he had stew, when in reality he had only biscuit and tea. He might mention a parcel of food arriving, even if it had not. In this way, letters became both a lifeline and a kind of performance, with each side trying to protect the other from the harsher truths. Hunger shaped not only the body but also the words exchanged across the distance. Perhaps one of the most haunting aspects of these letters was how often they lingered in memory after being read. A soldier might lie awake in the dugout, repeating to himself the description of a meal from home, as though savouring it in his thoughts. He might close his eyes and imagine sitting again at his family's table, the familiar sounds of cutlery and conversation filling the room. Some describe dreaming of food after reading such letters, their dreams more vivid and detailed than usual, as though the mind carried the words into sleep. Hunger and memory became intertwined, shaping even the private landscapes of thought and dream. It is easy to think of war as a matter of battles, of strategies and weapons, but for the men who lived it, the memory of food was often more immediate. Letters carried reminders of what they had lost, what they longed for, and what they hoped to return to. Hunger gave these words a weight that might otherwise have been overlooked. To someone well-fed, a mention of Sunday dinner might seem trivial. To a soldier in a dugout, it could become the most significant part of the letter, the detail that lingered long after the page was folded away. In this way, the memory of food became as much a part of the war as the sound of artillery or the sight of mud. There is a final curiosity worth noting. Some men kept their letters not in pockets or bags, but close to where they slept, even under their heads as a kind of pillow. They said it comforted them, but some also claimed that it brought better dreams filled with the meals described in ink. It may sound strange, but for men who lived surrounded by hunger, even the thought of food could shape the night. Perhaps it was no more than suggestion, the mind following the last thing it had read, but perhaps, too, there was something in the presence of the paper itself, as though the words carried more than meaning, carrying memory and comfort across the miles. To sleep with such a letter was to rest, at least for a time, in the memory of food, and in that memory, to find a kind of peace that the battlefield seldom offered. To think about hunger is to imagine an empty stomach, a hollow ache that asks for food. Yet on the battlefields of the First World War, hunger was more than an emptiness. It was a slow process, a quiet reshaping of the body that touched every part of daily life. It crept in gradually, often unnoticed at first, until it became as much a companion as the mud, the lice, or the sound of shells overhead. Soldiers learned to live with it, though living with it meant learning to accept changes in how their bodies worked, how they moved, even how they thought. The body under hunger became sluggish, though not in the dramatic way one might imagine. It was a gentler slowing, as though everything was wrapped in a kind of weight. Movements grew heavier, and lifting a rifle or marching across sodden ground demanded more effort than before. A soldier might not complain out loud, but he would notice it in small ways in the pause before standing, in the deeper breaths needed to climb out of a trench, in the way his arms trembled after carrying ammunition boxes. Hunger did not announce itself with sudden collapse. It revealed itself in the quiet fatigue that never lifted. One of the strangest effects of hunger was its influence on the mind. A man who had once spoken easily might find his words coming slower, his thoughts taking longer to form. Decision-making, even in ordinary matters, became harder, as though the brain were moving through mud as thick as the ground around him. Some soldiers described moments of confusion when simple tasks became oddly difficult. Others found themselves drifting into daydreams, unable to keep attention fixed. In this sense, hunger was not only a physical emptiness, but a fog that settled over the mind, dulling sharpness and slowing response. Sleep, too, was touched by hunger. It might come quickly, the body eager to rest and conserve its energy, but it was often restless, interrupted by dreams of food. Men spoke of dreaming entire banquets, of tables heavy with dishes that seemed real until the moment they woke. The dreams were not unpleasant, in fact. Many looked forward to them, but they carried with them a faint cruelty. To wake from such vivid meals to the taste of cold tea or stale bread was to feel the ache of hunger renewed, sharper than before. Hunger made sleep both an escape and a reminder, a place where food could be tasted again, though only in imagination. The body under hunger also changed in ways visible to others. Cheeks grew hollow, uniforms hung more loosely, and hands seemed bonier than before. Soldiers joked about their own thinness, comparing themselves to scarecrows, though beneath the humour was unease. They noticed how slowly cuts healed, how bruises lingered longer, how exhaustion came sooner. The body revealed its need for nourishment in countless small signs, each one a whisper of the slow wear taking place within. To be hungry was not only to feel empty, it was to watch oneself becoming smaller, weaker, less able to endure. Curiously, hunger altered the senses in ways that seemed almost paradoxical. Some soldiers described food they did have as tasting stronger than before, the salt of bully beef more pronounced, the bitterness of ersatz coffee sharper. Hunger heightened awareness, turning ordinary meals into intense experiences. Yet at the same time, other tastes seemed to fade, as though the palate grew weary of sameness. Bread became tasteless, biscuits dull, even tea seemed to lose its comfort when consumed too often without variety. Hunger, then, both sharpened and dulled, making men more attentive to the smallest variations while also rendering monotony unbearable. Another quiet change came in the rhythms of the body itself. Hunger altered digestion, slowed it down, made the stomach cramp or ache in ways unfamiliar. Some men found themselves unable to finish their meagre rations, not because they did not want them, but because their bodies could not process them as before. Others ate greedily, finishing quickly, and still wanting more, only to feel sick afterward. The body's natural balance, disrupted by constant want, shifted into irregular patterns that each man came to know in his own way. Hunger became not only an ache, but a condition of being, shaping the body's cycles day after day. Perhaps most curious of all was the way hunger seemed to change perception of time. Minutes dragged, hours lengthened, and the gaps between meals felt like stretches of eternity. A soldier waiting for rations could swear that a day had passed, only to find it had been little more than an hour. Hunger filled the empty spaces, making time itself seem slower. This distortion was not dramatic, but it was constant, a subtle bending of perception that made each day feel longer than it was. The war itself seemed endless, stretched not only by battles and waiting, but by the way hunger expanded every moment of anticipation. In the dugouts, hunger also revealed itself in posture and movement. Men sat hunched, conserving energy, their shoulders drawn forward as though to shield themselves from emptiness. They moved more slowly, even when no danger was present, and when they laughed it was often softer, less energetic, a kind of weary amusement. These physical signals were unspoken but understood. No one needed to say aloud that they were hungry. The body declared it in the slump of the back, in the quiet rubbing of a stomach, in the way eyes followed every bite of food that appeared. One strange curiosity, noted by some, was the way hunger influenced smell. Men claimed they could detect the faint aroma of food from great distances, noticing when someone opened a tin even in another dugout. The smell of bread, when it rarely appeared, seemed to spread with remarkable speed, drawing attention instantly. In conditions where so many scents mingled mud, smoke, decay, the smell of food rose above them all, sharp and unmistakable. Hunger trained the nose as much as it trained the mind, making men more sensitive to the smallest traces of nourishment. There is a certain irony in the fact that the body under hunger, weakened and slowed, was still expected to endure the greatest physical demands. Marches continued, labour in the trenches went on, battles were fought. The men adapted as best they could, pushing through exhaustion, carrying loads that felt heavier with each passing day. Their bodies bore it, though at great cost, and often at a slower pace. Hunger did not stop the war, but it made every task more burdensome, every effort more draining. The soldiers carried not only their rifles and packs, but also the quiet weight of their own diminishing strength. In the long view, hunger left its mark, even after the war ended. Men who survived sometimes remembered not only the battles but the persistent ache of emptiness, the weakness in their limbs, the taste of food that never came. Their bodies had carried the memory, and in later years they spoke of it with the same clarity as they spoke of shells or mud. Hunger was not an event but a condition, a state of being that shaped their wartime experience as deeply as any weapon or uniform. It became part of who they were, etched into memory through the body itself. In reflecting on hunger's effects, one cannot help but notice its strange duality. It weakened and dulled, yet also sharpened certain senses. It slowed time, yet made the smallest meals vivid. It drained energy, yet taught men to conserve and endure. Hunger was both absence and presence, both emptiness and a kind of heightened awareness. The body under hunger was not simply less, it was changed, redefined by the constant lack. To live in such a body was to live in a world where every movement, every thought, every moment was shaped by the quiet demand for food that never truly arrived. And so, in the dugouts and on the battlefields, the body under hunger moved through the days of war. It bent, it weakened, it adapted, and it endured. It carried rifles, dug trenches, marched roads, and waited through nights, all while whispering its constant reminder. Hunger was not just an ache in the stomach, it was in the slowed heartbeat, in the heaviness of the limbs, in the fog of the mind. It was written in posture, in speech, in sleep, in dreams. The war demanded everything from the body, and hunger made that demand even greater, until survival itself seemed a matter not only of avoiding shells and bullets, but of simply finding enough strength to continue. Among the many quiet aspects of life in the trenches, there existed one that rarely found its way into official reports, yet lingered powerfully in memory. It was the act of sharing, not the grand, formalized distribution of supplies that officers arranged, but the small, almost hidden gestures, one soldier passing a crust of bread to another, or a tin of jam being split open and scooped with the edge of a knife, so that each man might take just a small taste. These were not moments of plenty, but of scarcity, and perhaps that was why they carried such weight. The hunger gnawed at all of them, and because of that, the act of giving even the smallest portion of food became something quietly profound. It is curious to consider that in such a brutal, impersonal war, where artillery pounded without pause and the dead were carried off by the hundreds, some of the most powerful memories were shaped by half a biscuit or a single cigarette passed between calloused fingers. Food, or rather the lack of it, became a kind of currency, yet it was not always spent in a calculating way. Instead, it flowed in tiny exchanges that stitched together a fragile sense of humanity. One soldier might remember forever the time a comrade split his last preserved plum, or the way another gave him the thicker half of a slice of bread, with the butter still clinging faintly to the edges. The bond created through sharing was not always spoken of. Words seemed too clumsy, too loud, for moments that unfolded softly in the dim light of a dugout, or by the glow of a small candle stub balanced on a crate. Often, nothing was said at all. A hand would reach out, place something on a neighbour's lap, and then retreat back into the folds of a greatcoat. The receiver might give a small nod, or perhaps say nothing at all, allowing the silence to carry the meaning. These gestures lingered longer in memory than the explosions or the marching orders. Hunger stripped life down to essentials, and in that stripped-down world, kindness became as nourishing as the food itself. One strange quality of hunger is that it seems to heighten memory. Soldiers later described how vividly they remembered meals from their childhood, the smell of bread baking in a family kitchen, or the taste of apples taken from an autumn orchard. Yet alongside those remembered feasts, the small trench-bound acts of sharing etched themselves just as clearly into recollection. A soldier might remember the warmth of tea offered on a freezing night, or the faint sweetness of condensed milk shared across the rim of a battered tin mug. It was not only the taste that lingered, but the sense of companionship that wrapped itself around the act. Hunger also blurred the boundaries between self and other. When food was scarce, one man's stomach growled in harmony with another's. This shared suffering created a strange kind of equality, softening ranks and backgrounds. Men from farms and men from cities, men who might never have spoken to each other in civilian life, now leaned close to divide a scrap of food. The sharing, in its quiet way, was an acknowledgement. We are both enduring this. We are both in need, and here is what I can give, even if it is only a mouthful. Not all sharing was voluntary. Sometimes food was pooled together by necessity, as when a group cooked their rations in a single pot, creating a thin stew that tasted of little more than hot water and whatever few fragments could be thrown in. Yet even this pooling created a communal bond. To eat from the same pot was to admit that survival depended not just on one's own portion, but on the group as a whole. There was something almost ritualistic in the way spoons dipped into the pot, one after the other, each man waiting for his turn in the dim light. The taste was unremarkable, often barely edible, yet the act itself carried quiet weight. Curiously, food sharing sometimes extended even to enemies. Accounts exist of brief truces, moments between bombardments, when men called across the wire, trading a cigarette for a bit of bread, or tossing a can of preserved meat into the no-man's land where it could be picked up. These moments were fleeting and unofficial, almost secret, yet they suggest how hunger softened even the edges of enmity. The stomach, after all, knows little of politics. To give food was to acknowledge in some small way the common humanity that lay beneath the uniforms. For many soldiers, these acts of sharing became the threads of memory that outlasted the war itself. Years later, veterans described not just the battles or the wounds, but the taste of jam given to them in a dugout, or the way a comrade offered his last biscuit before collapsing into sleep. These stories were not told with grandeur, but with a softness that suggested something sacred had occurred in those exchanges. Hunger had stripped them bare, Yet it had also revealed something enduring: the capacity to give, even when there was almost nothing to give. It is strange to think that the memory of hunger could be softened by such gestures, but perhaps that is the paradox of war. The very harshness of the trenches made even the smallest kindness shine brighter. In a world of mud, rats, and rumbling artillery, a single act of sharing became a light that men carried with them. And though food in the trenches was often poor, monotonous, or absent altogether, the memory of sharing turned those tasteless crumbs into something else entirely. They became reminders that even in a place designed to strip away humanity, men could still find ways to be quietly, stubbornly human. As we reflect on this, it is worth pausing on the strange silence that accompanied these exchanges. They did not need speeches or declarations. The hunger was already understood, and the gift was already received before words could be formed. Silence became the vessel of meaning, carrying with it the weight of gratitude, the acknowledgement of suffering, and the recognition of survival. In the end, it was not the food itself that nourished them most deeply, but the silent bond of sharing, which endured long after the hunger had passed. Hunger, in the trenches of the First World War, was not a passing inconvenience. It was not the mild discomfort one might feel after skipping lunch, nor the appetite that grows before dinner at home. It was something else entirely, something heavier, quieter, and yet strangely persistent. It was a companion that never left, always hovering close, shaping how men thought, how they spoke, how they remembered. Hunger was in the background of every day, every night, a presence that defined the rhythm of life on the battlefield. To speak of the war without speaking of hunger is to leave out one of its most constant, most intimate realities. What made hunger so powerful in this setting was its relentlessness. Other hardships, the thunder of shells, the sting of gas, the wetness of mud came and went in bursts. There were days of bombardment, followed by lulls. There were sudden gas attacks, followed by hours of eerie quiet. But hunger was never truly absent. Even when rations were delivered, even when bread or bully beef was in hand, there remained the lingering sense that it was not enough, that it would not last. Meals were small, often unsatisfying, and rarely nourishing in any complete sense. Eating dulled the sharp edge of hunger for a short while, but it never banished the companion completely. Hunger walked with them in the morning, followed them into the night, and stirred awake beside them when the day began again. Some soldiers came to think of hunger almost as if it were alive, an invisible figure sitting alongside them in the dugout. In memoirs, one finds descriptions of it not just as a physical pang, but as a kind of presence, something that whispered in the background, demanding attention, bending thoughts toward food even when there was none to be had. In this way, hunger resembled the mud or the rats, not merely an inconvenience, but a feature of the environment, a part of the landscape of war. Men could grow accustomed to the sound of artillery or the sight of barbed wire, and in the same way they grew accustomed to hunger's company, though they never learned to enjoy it. It is curious to notice how hunger shaped the mind. It is said that men thought of food more than of home, more than of rest, sometimes even more than of victory. The imagination wandered toward meals not eaten, dishes remembered, flavors that seemed impossibly far away. Letters home were filled not only with news and longing, but with requests for food parcels. Soldiers asked for chocolate, biscuits, jams, and sometimes the simplest of things, a piece of bread from a family bakery, or a jar of pickles from a neighborhood shop. When those packages arrived, they were treasured, not only for the sustenance they provided, but for the connection they carried to a world where hunger was not constant. Yet even the memory of those tastes faded quickly, overtaken again by the reality of the empty stomach. Hunger also influenced the way time passed. Hours without food seemed to stretch longer, as though the clock itself had slowed. Days became measured, not by the rising and setting of the sun, but by the intervals between meals, and by the knowledge that what was coming would not be enough. In a strange way, hunger bent the shape of time itself, making minutes feel heavier and nights seem longer. It became a calendar of its own, with men keeping count not in days of the month, but in how long it had been since they had eaten something that filled them. At times, hunger revealed its strangeness in more unusual ways. Men spoke of dreaming of food so vividly that upon waking, they believed for a moment they had eaten. Others described the curious habit of chewing on things that were not food at all: straw, cigarette ends, even bits of paper, simply to quiet the body's restless demand for something to chew. In one account, a soldier spoke of sucking on buttons, their hard edges providing no nourishment at all, yet tricking the body into believing something had been consumed. These acts might sound odd, even absurd, yet they were born of necessity, small rituals to soothe an ever-present companion that could not be driven away. There was also the strange effect hunger had on relationships. Just as it had created bonds through sharing, it sometimes sowed tension and suspicion. A soldier might glance toward another's ration with an unspoken question in his eyes, wondering if his comrade had been given more or had managed to save something for later. Even friends could grow silent when food was scarce, each guarding their small portion closely. Yet, in time, even these silences softened, for all of them understood that hunger was not an individual failure, but a shared condition. They were bound together by the knowledge that everyone was carrying the same constant companion. What lingers most deeply in the recollections of veterans is not a single episode of hunger, but its persistence. It was not an occasional visitor, but something closer to a shadow. When men left the trenches, whether on leave or at war's end, some carried with them a changed relationship to food. They spoke of never taking bread for granted, of eating more slowly, more deliberately, as though still haunted by the memory of scarcity. Others admitted that even years later, hunger's shadow followed them into civilian life, shaping habits at the table and dreams in the night. The companion of the trenches did not vanish when the war was over. It lingered, quiet and invisible, long after the uniforms were folded away. If one pauses to reflect, it becomes clear that hunger, more than many other hardships, revealed something essential about endurance. It was not the dramatic kind of endurance that made for stories of bravery, but the slow, quiet endurance of simply carrying on, day after day, with a body that never felt satisfied. In this way, hunger taught its own lesson, that survival in the trenches was less about great victories and more about small continuances. The ability to exist alongside discomfort without surrendering entirely to it. Hunger was not defeated, but endured, and in enduring, men learned something about the strange resilience of the human spirit. There is something quietly profound in imagining hunger not as an enemy, but as a companion, an unwelcome one, perhaps, but one that marched beside them through mud and fire. It shaped their thoughts, their dreams, their bonds, their memories. It whispered in the background of every moment, sometimes cruelly, sometimes strangely gently, reminding them always of the body's needs and the limits of its strength. In that sense, hunger was not only a hardship, but a teacher of sorts, pressing upon them the meaning of scarcity, of patience, and of shared endurance. And now, as we close this long reflection, perhaps hunger's shadow lingers still in the telling, for in speaking of it, we too have walked alongside that constant companion, if only in thought. We have seen how it shaped days and nights, how it carved itself into memory, and how it bound men together in silence and in sharing. It was not glamorous nor dramatic, but it was real, steady, and ever-present. Hunger was the quiet heartbeat of the trenches, never loud, never absent. And so, with that companion finally set aside for the evening, Let us allow the mind to rest. The hunger that haunted those soldiers belongs to their time, not to ours, and it need not trouble you now. May your own night be filled not with longing, but with peace, and may the quiet of rest settle gently around you. Good night.